Hey, so before I get started, I just wanted to point somebody out because every once in a while I'm like, what if I embarrass this week? Just kidding, I don't really do that. But super proud of this young man, Mr. Ed Leary. Would you stand up? He just finished boot camp for the Marines.
Wow!
Right? Come on. Wow. And also, so he is private first class in the United States Marine Corps. And so anyways, ladies, we're taking, never mind, we're going to stay away from that. Stay away from that. And anyway, we're proud of him, and that's super awesome. So make sure you give him a high five or a hug afterwards, and just tell him that's awesome. He used to play guitar for us. Anyways, it's really cool to see him. Good to see you, man. Yes, that's cool. What if you'd have said, well, I hate you? I don't know. That would have been really weird. So let's continue on. Anybody like history in here? Anybody at all like history? I love history. Let's talk about early American history, shall we? I mean, early American history, there's this guy, and many of us, probably all of us know the guy. His name is George Washington, and he was our first president. George Washington. Now, what if I were to teach you a little bit about American history, and specifically George Washington? Now, what if I did that? I also like this guy named John Grisham, which has nothing to do with American history. But I'm a big fan of John Grisham. Like him, critical of a few of his books, but I've been a big fan of his over the years, since the middle 90s or so. And so, what if I were to teach you about about George Washington using analogies from John Grisham's books? I just read a book called Sycamore Road. What if I were to do that? The truth is, that probably wouldn't work very well. And the reason is, and maybe I could find an analogy here, an analogy there, every once in a while, but probably it wouldn't work all that well. And the reason is because I couldn't give you, using Sycamore Row, I couldn't give you the proper context or the proper history regarding the things that George Washington did or said, unless, of course, John Grisham, his next book, might be some sort of history book, and you could come up to me and say, see, you could do it. But typically speaking, that's not going to happen. So one of the problems that we have when we teach the Bible sometimes is we talk about these things, and we talk about Jesus, and we talk about Peter or Paul or things like that, people you may have heard of, and we do so in ways and analogies. I think this is a great way to teach is analogies. But we do so in a way that best describes our culture. So we might take something that Jesus says, right? Or a story he told and say, what he was saying is just like what I went through yesterday. And the reality is, he could have been saying something very, very different. Because he was talking to a group of people that were thinking very differently than we do. He was talking to a group of people that were thinking, they were just obviously millennia away from where we are today. As a matter of fact, this is what I see a lot of times in the Old Testament, and I do this sometimes. We take Old Testament stories, and to make it applicable, we completely ignore what was actually happening, or what the Jewish story was actually saying. So over the next 4 weeks, what I want to do is this. We're going to ask this question. Is Jesus Lord? Is Jesus Lord? I mean, what a fantastic, fantastic question. Sometimes it's a pretty, controversial question, right? As a matter of fact, C.S. Lewis made this statement. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or he would be the devil of hell. You must take your choice. Either this was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. So what we want to do, starting today, and we're not going to talk a lot about Jesus today, what I want to do is introduce you to the world that he came into. To share with you a little bit of what the Jewish story was talking about, and the Old Testament was talking about. Because here's what happens. Sometimes we simply take good moral ideas from the Old Testament without thinking of a great overarching story that the Old Testament is really telling you about. So, just like America, the people of Israel had an amazing, amazing story. And it was centered around this point. That God, who was known to the Jews as Yahweh, was their creator God. Now, this was pretty compelling during the days of Abraham, the early days of the Bible, because everyone had gods for everything at this point. They had the god of war, the god of love, the god of thunder, Thor, right? I mean, they had all these different gods. I knew I just grabbed the nerds in some of you. Like, inner nerds. I just grabbed Thor. I love that movie. You know, all these different, they had all these different gods. And so, all of a sudden, this teaching of one God was really, really weird. Of course, we're on the other side of that. We're like, well, you know, everybody kind of thinks about one God, or most people now in the world. But this was revolutionary at this time. The idea that there was one God. And to the Jews, he was known as Yahweh, their creator God. And their story continued that God created Adam and Eve, and you could say God created mankind and designed them to be his very own images, or icons, reflections of his glory. That mankind was called to be followers of God, and in that following, that they would be reflections of his glory. Now, like any great story, there was a turn. And if Edison was still up there, I'd have him go, dun, dun, dun. Because that would just be cool. Maybe next week. But that turn, of course, revolved around sin. Because of sin, Adam and Eve and mankind are saddled with selfishness. And the world begins to unravel with murder and isolation from one another. And rebellious sabotaging of the icons by making their own icons. In other words, mankind decided we want to make other reflections. It's better. We think we are better creators than the creator God. And so they decide to worship all these other things. And the great part of this story, all throughout the Jewish story, is that God does not abandon his special icons. So to restore mankind's descendants, or Adam and Eve's descendants, to their iconic glory, God forms a covenant. In the Old Testament, you can find these covenants all over in Genesis and Exodus. And just a great. By the way, let me just say this. There is reading plans, and I frequently do this reading plan called the 90-day reading plan through Scripture. And you can find this on YouVersion, which also you can find our notes if you have apps, Android or iTunes or whatever, Apple, however it goes. And one of the amazing things about reading through Scripture in 90 days is that you see the whole story and how it all fits together. It's really pretty incredible. So God forms covenants with Abraham, with Moses, and with eventually David, the ultimate king hero of Israel. And he gives Israel the land, he gives them temple, and he makes them a nation. He blesses them. Now, here's an underlying promise in this whole story. Is that God says, I will be your God. Yahweh will be their God, but Israel must make Yahweh its sole God, to whom Israel will be faithful. And this premise is found throughout the whole Old Testament. If Israel is faithful, God will bless Israel and her land and her temples. Now, once again, we're going back to this whole group of people in the Old Testament that is detached from many of you, and we're going to get... Now, I'm going to bring this all together, but try to grab onto this is the story, and it's really a crazy, awesome story of the Jewish people. I mean, the David and Goliath story, that's part of it. I mean, it goes up and down. It's like, whoa. And there's things that you probably looked at as a skeptic at times and goes, you know, this is weird, and this isn't the Bible, so the Bible isn't true. Which is really great thinking. That was sarcasm. So what we have to do is when we grab onto this story and read it through, we begin to see all these amazing things that the Jewish people did and believed. One of the things that they did and had in their midst, one of the symbols that was an amazing part of the story was called the temple. Okay, you've probably heard of the Jewish temple. But it was regarded as the place where Yahweh lived and ruled in the midst of Israel. Now, this is why many people today feel like that a building is so important, because Israel had this really important building. The temple combined in itself the functions of these three things: religion, the national figurehead of Israel, and government. Something of note here: the temple, planned by David and built by King Solomon, was as political as it was religious. That there wasn't a division of secular and sacred in their midst. It was all the same thing. So the high priest, who was in charge of the temple, was as important a political figure as he was a religious one. Or Jerusalem wasn't like other cities. Other cities had temples dotted around their big cities, but Jerusalem was a temple, and people happened to be around that temple. And they were very protective of their temple. It was, as a people, they were basically the Babylonians came in the 5th century BC and destroyed Jerusalem. When they destroyed Jerusalem, they destroyed the temple. This was crushing for the people of Israel. And they understood it as their reasoning was because we have been unfaithful to God. Now, here's the thing. Eventually, in the book of Ezra and other places, the temple was rebuilt. Many of those people, by the way, were taken to exile in Babylon. And that's an important point, too. We'll get to it in a few minutes. Herod the Great, during the time of Jesus, he actually reconditioned the temple. This is how protected they were. It became one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, this temple. And the Jewish people felt it was polluted because people from Israel, a Jewish person did not recondition the building, but Herod did. So this is one of the most important symbols that was a connection to God. Here's another symbol. Their land was a symbol. Their land was given to them by God. And then Moses brought them to their land, and Joshua brought them into their land. It was God's promised land. They viewed this land as a part of the covenant because of the blessings that they received from it. This is where the idea of tithe came in, if you've ever heard of that term. because they believed that their land, their blessings, that they came from their land, was from God. They believed that everything that they had came from God. It wasn't theirs. So in other words, their tithe or their gifts wasn't a lottery ticket. Wasn't because we want to do something, we want to get things, we want God to bless us. It was because God has blessed them. And as a result of God's blessing, we want to share that back with Him. So in Jesus' day, the Jews believed, once again, just like the temple, that their land was polluted. Because what happened was, in the 5th century BC, the Babylonians came in, destroyed Jerusalem. Then they came back, and after Babylon, Persia took over Jerusalem. Because Persia took over Babylon. And then after that, Greece and Alexander the Great. And we get into history that many of us know about in ancient history. And then beyond that, there was a time of independence, and then the great empire of Rome came through. And they believed that because Rome was in charge of all this now, that their land was polluted. Another part of the story is this. As we look in the Old Testament, Israel is not faithful. And so Israel wakes up one morning in a foreign country, or exile. Here's the third symbol that's important. That third symbol that was so important is called Torah. Now, Torah is the law, Genesis through Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And that was their law, their Torah. It was the covenant charter of Israel. One person said temple and Torah formed an unbreakable whole. The Torah sanctioned and regulated what happened in the temple, or the place where God was inhabited. And the temple was the practical focal point for the observance of Torah. During much of the Old Testament, the temple was the most important part of the Jewish idea of worship. But then, when they all were moved to exile, when they all were exiled to Babylon, you don't have a building. They didn't have a temple. So the Torah, or the law, became so much more important to their spiritual connection with God. Okay? It was not uncommon, for millions of ordinary Jews, Torah became a portable land, a movable temple. It was not uncommon for this phrase, where 2 or 3 gather to study Torah, the Shekinah, or the glory of God, rests on them. They were promised that if they repented, God would restore Israel once again to its land and to blessings. This brings us to the last symbol. Temple, Torah, and racial identity. One huge thing we find in the Old Testament is that the Jews must stay together and must not compromise with what they call pagans. Many of the stories we find in the Old Testament, from the Torah to Esther to many of the prophets, tell the importance that the Jews must set a good example to the world, yet must in some ways remain clearly distinct. This was ingrained in their culture, in their desire to be an independent country ruled by God. As a matter of fact, God promised that He would restore Israel once again to its land and turn it into His kingdom. He promised He would send a Messiah, a Savior, to make all of this happen, to bring in this new kingdom. And so they were expecting this new kingdom with this new king. They were expecting God to do amazing things. And the way they were trying to do it was by obeying all these laws. In fact, the law at this point, when Jesus came into the world, wasn't just Torah, but it was also, there was a part of it called Mishnah, which was the oral Torah. And it turned to just as important as the Torah to people like the Pharisees and others. And they believed God was going to do something great. Now, I want to read a passage of Scripture that maybe, if you've decided, I'm going to read the New Testament, and I'm going to read about Jesus, and maybe you've come to this place, okay, and read this, and you started off and you were like, whoa, this is really boring already, and I just got to the first 5 verses, right? And because it is a genealogy of Jesus. But Matthew talks about it, and he shares it, and it was such an important reason why he starts off his gospel like this. Matthew chapter 1 and verse 1. Please stay with me. We're almost there, my friends. Okay? It really is exciting, and I'm just touching the tip of what we can learn here, okay? There's so much. Verse 1. This is a record of the ancestors of Jesus, the Messiah, or the one who the Jews believed that would bring them God's kingdom back in. A descendant of David and of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Here we go. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez was the mother of Hezron. Hezron was the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Amminadab. Amminadab was the father of Nastan. Nastan was the father of Salmon. Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. He's a big name in the Old Testament. Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed was the father of Jesse. Jesse was the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother was Bathsheba, the widow of Uriah. Solomon was the father of Rehoboam. Rehoboam was the father of Abijah. Abijah was the father of Asa. Asa was the father of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat was the father of Jehoram. Jehoram was the father of Uzziah. Uzziah was the father of Jotham. Jotham was the father of Ahaz. Ahaz was the father of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was the father of Manasseh. Manasseh was the father of Amon. Amon was the father of Josiah. Josiah was the father of Jehoiakim. And his brothers... Okay, I lost it. Why don't we read together? Why don't we do something together? So, you want to try this? Some of you are going, yeah, I'm smart. Some of you are going, no thanks. Let's try it together. Here we go. Josiah was the father of Jehoiakim and his brothers, born at the time of the exile to Babylon. After the Babylonian exile, Jehoiakim was the father of Shealtiel was the father of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was the father of Abiad. Abiad was the father of Eliakim. Eliakim was the father of Azor. Azor was the father of Zadok. Zadok was the father of Achim. Achim was the father of Eliab. Eliab was the father of Eleazar. Eleazar was the father of Mathan. Mathan was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Joseph, Mary. Mary gave birth to Jesus, who is called Messiah. Give yourselves a big hand. It was important to the Jewish people that their Messiah was connected to where they were from, because this is what was promised. This is what was always prophesied through the prophets, that that person was Jewish. This is where Israel was. Jesus came to the place where they basically were trying to have a kingdom like God, and they were wanting to obey rules. Now, here we go. Finally, my bread and butter. Wanting to obey rules. Let me ask you a question. When you want to be considered faithful, because this is what they were doing. They were desperately trying to make God happy by obeying all the rules. So they tried really hard. Have you ever tried something really hard? I can do this. And it feels like it's never enough. Maybe you have a relationship with someone, and in the midst of that relationship, In the midst of that relationship, you're desperately trying to make them happy, and you're trying to go through the checklist in your mind, or the checklist even that they've given you, and in the process of that, what's happening is it seems like it's never enough. And you're like, God, if it's God, or if it's a family member, or if you're in a relationship of some sort, and you can never make them happy, and you go through the rules, and you go through the list, and you go through the thing, and nothing is right. This is what the Jewish people, this is where they were at. For hundreds and hundreds of years, they tried. And the reason they were trying is why you and I didn't try a lot to appease God. Because we weren't doing it right in the first place. And so we went through punishment. We went through hard times. Have you ever been there? Like things go bad. Oh yeah, I should go to God. Oh yeah, life is miserable. God, why are you doing this to me? Why would you do this to me? And all along, God was there, but we didn't think about it until we got jacked up. And all of a sudden, God, I love you. This is where they were at. And they tried, and they tried, and they tried. But remember the second part of Israel's story, the way it was intended? God created Adam and Eve and mankind and designed them to be His very own images, His eikon, reflections of His glory, not heartless puppets. If you wanted to be faithful, if you wanted to be considered faithful to your husband, your wife, your spouse, or a friend, or your job, whatever it is, would you do that or expect to do that by following a list of rules that they've given you? How exciting would that be, huh? Wow, what a great relationship that would be. Now, this has never happened. Carrie, I really want to be faithful to you. Can you give me a list of things I can do? Wouldn't that be ridiculous? Faithfulness is not connected to the list of things that you can or can't do for that person. Faithfulness has to do with the surrender of your heart. So when we base our relationship with God on trying to be good, that's not good. What we found, like the Israelites, is we have a love story too. You see, the Jewish people spelled it out in a beautiful story of the Old Testament. But the truth is, you and I have the same story. And the first part of that story, the first turn, is that we live in a world. And we are in a world. And we are a part of a world that's broken. Oh, I mean, we don't need to give stories. I mean, we all see it around us. The selfishness, even that's in our own lives. The hurt, the pain, the brokenness in our family, in the stories of those we love, the tears, on the news every single day that we see on Facebook when that person decides they're going to lash out and tell it like it is. They're not saying, I'm trying to fix it. They're saying, in different ways that seems logical to them, I am broken. I am hurting. And I've just decided to tweet it instead of tell everybody. I am broken. My society is broken. And I'm going to throw this out there. This is the kind of world that Jesus came into. The beautiful thing about a story, any good story, you like TV, I like TV, you know, any good story or movie, is every story has a hero. Every great story has somebody, male or female, who comes in and saves the day. Whether it's, I don't know, Peter Pan or Rudy. That's a great story, huh? Revenge. Well, I don't know if that's a great story. I just said it. Whatever the great stories are, every great story has a hero. The question is, who do you think the hero is in your life? The people of Israel had a thought process. I think the hero is... And Jesus came in, and they had blinders on. They couldn't see it. They couldn't see that this poor, lowly son of a carpenter could be the hero of the entire world. A broken world full of chaos, stories, and symbols. It is in those broken times that we begin to look for a crutch. I mean, we all have crutches. Everybody says religion is a crutch. Everything we do can be a crutch, or is a crutch. From education, to family, to entertainment. Tonight is a major form of entertainment, right? Everything we do is a crutch to get through the world that is broken. So this is how I want to take this message full of history and context and make it applicable here. I believe the Bible teaches that God created you, as He created the people of Israel, to be reflections of His glory. But because of sin, we choose at times to do our own thing, to go our own way. If you follow Jesus, why? To really begin to ask yourself, in your heart, why do I follow Jesus? Is it because you want to win the great big lottery ticket at the end? Oh, if I just obey the right amount of rules. Oh, if I just do enough good things. Oh, if I just be nice to enough people and don't gossip, and just kind of even it out, make sure I'm nicer than I'm not nice. If I just do that, I'll get the big lottery ticket, or something good will happen. Or is it because you have a creator God that you are in relationship with, and you are an image bearer for His glory? And so you live your life with that thought that you are a reflection of Him, His image, an icon. Or we're just trying to get through this to be nice. Because here's the problem with that. If you are trying to get through it to be nice because you think it'll be good for the kids or whatever, if that is the case, you will eventually stop doing it. Because there are other, better ways to be nice than thinking about God. Because there are times in the Christian faith that being nice is not the prescription. But we are called to challenge one another. But we're called to love one another in truth. So being nice is not always the prescription in the Christian faith. So eventually you'll see that and go, I'm not interested in that, I'm out of here. Secondly, if you don't follow Jesus, why not? Something, once again, that you would ask yourself. Could it be that you have a misconception of who Jesus is because of who someone you knew claimed Him to be, and they went on and treated you like crud? And that person, while maybe they had good intentions, they didn't have maybe a great grasp of the gospel, the good news of Jesus. And so you are now possibly tainted by all the things that have been done to you by that people or those people or that group of people. And so you're putting your blinders on who Jesus really was. I had this experience when I was just out of college, where I decided I wanted to be the image bearer. I wanted to create a new image bearer. I was the image bearer of Marty, which was great. I wanted to give Marty glory. It was really awesome until it wasn't, really fast. And all of a sudden, I was downtrodden, I was messed up, I was miserable. And those were my choices, my mistakes. But here's the thing. There was a group of people at that point, a family, who decided they were going to love on me no matter what choices I made. One of them was on stage here a few months ago. He ran the Hungry for a Day program that we focused on. And him and his family loved on me. They said, Marty, I don't care what you've done or what you're doing or what's going on in your life. We want you to know that God loves you and Jesus loves you. What were they doing? They were being image bearers for God. They were being icons, reflections of the glory of God here on this earth. And this is what I believe that all churches are called to do. This is what I want Fellowship Church to be. Reflections of the glory of God. I don't care how old you are. I don't care how young you are. I don't care where you come from, what your background is. We are called to take the image of God and reflect that as best we can. And we're able to do that because of the sacrifice and love of Jesus. We were not free before Jesus. We were pinned to our own selfishness, to our own pride, to our own greed. And he showed us there's something more. There's something more. I believe as you look into the life of Jesus in the Old Testament and the New Testament, if you really look, you will find that something more. That's a little bit about the world that Jesus came into. My prayer, this is what I want us to do. Here we go. Here we go. I want you to read this week the Gospel of Matthew, if you would. Just going through the Gospel of Matthew, look into it. He talks a lot about the Jewish culture as he writes. Look at it, read through it, and next week we're going to talk specifically about the kind of person Jesus was. Have you ever thought about that?